Hello, church. Welcome to Exodus 23 and 24. Before we even start this passage today, consider Psalm 119 when it says, "Open my eyes that I might see wonderful things in your law." As we start diving into the law and the Old Testament, make that your prayer and then watch out. The Lord will love to answer that prayer and you will be blown away by what you see. Let me give you an example. As we read today through some of these laws, you're going to see, it feels to me like the words are so closely connected to what Jesus himself said that these words that we read in Exodus are almost written in red. Okay? Let me just rattle off a couple, and I want to show you how those apply to our lives. Because every time we read a law here that we recognize is a moral law connected to the New Testament, that moral law connected to the New Testament applies to your life today. And every one of those could be a question that you ask the Lord, do I live like that, or how could I live like that more? Let me give you an example. 23 verse 1 says, do not spread false reports. What do you think Jesus talked about Satan in John 8 when he says he's the father of lies, but I've come, I am the truth, right? John 18, he says, this is the reason I came. And so you could already ask yourself this question. When I speak, do I spread false reports? Do I speak half-truths, or do I speak the truth? That would be a simple question. In verse 2, do not follow the crowd. What did Jesus say in Matthew 7? Don't go down the broad road, go down the narrow road, right? Look at verse 3 and verse 6. It says, do not show favoritism. That's exactly what it says in James chapter 2. It's the same commandment given there. You could also note, by the way, that it says, do not show favoritism to the poor man in his lawsuit, right? The moral laws apply to everybody regardless of wealth and status. They apply to everybody the same. Verse 5, do you see the donkey of someone who hates you fallen? Go and help him. Well, first of all, in Luke 6, for instance, Jesus said almost exactly the same words. He says, do good to those who hate you. These words are almost exactly the same as Jesus' words. And I know you and I don't see donkeys walking around today very often. But what is common when we're driving down the road, we might see a car with a flat tire or something like that, or maybe it's at the grocery store and you see somebody struggling with a shopping cart or whatever. Do you go and help that person? In fact, if you notice that it was somebody who actually didn't like you very much, you should go and help that person, right? That's how we can apply these things to our lives today. Verse 8 talks about do not accept a bribe. Jesus gave a perfect example of that by not accepting a bribe from Satan when he offered him everything in this world. Jesus says, what would it gain a person to forfeit his soul and yet gain the world? And so we can apply that today. Do I accept a bribe? Do you realize that? Little practical example. If you're paying for something in cash and the cashier gives you too much money back and you know it right in the moment, sometimes you and I accept a little bit of a bribe like that from Satan for like $2. It's ridiculous. This applies to our life today. We should be quick to be honest in those places because of what God's word says, both in the Old Testament connected to the New Testament, right? In verse 9, it says, do not oppress a foreigner. This reminds us of what Jesus said when he talked about the parable of the Good Samaritan and how to help your neighbor and be a neighbor to even someone who's from a different nationality, right? Like the Samaritan was. And you could apply that to your life today. Is this how I live that out? And if you look at if you go into verse 10 and verse 12, and it talks about this pattern of rest, do I live like that? If you look at the feasts, the feast here all connect to Jesus. You look at in verse 19, the best of your first fruits, that connects very much to what Jesus said about the widow and the 2 pennies that she gave. And you could ask yourself this question, do I practice faith-filled giving like that? And then you go on to verse 23, verse 25 and 26, and it almost says exactly what Jesus says in Matthew 6:33. Seek first my kingdom and my righteousness, and all of these things will be added to you as well. And again, you could ask yourself, do I live like this? And just park on any one of those questions as we go through the law. But I want to point out 2 more things as we get into maybe 3. In verse 28, 29, and 30, there's an aspect of little by little. That aspect even applies to our lives today, because nobody gets there in a moment. When we're following Jesus, it takes time. He understands that there's layers, there's seasons, we grow. Nobody arrives in a moment. And so God, he realizes that, and you and I should realize that as well. And then I want to point out, when you get into chapter 24, verses 9 and 10, and even into verse 13 and 14, you'll recognize that Aaron and his comrades have gone up the mountain, let's call it part way, and Moses tells them to wait there. They're encountering the presence of the Lord already. They catch a glimpse of him. They see his feet on Sapphire Street. In other words, they are catching a glimpse of God, and they're trying to describe it. And it's similar to what John describes in Revelation in chapter 21 about this clear street of some kind of a jewel. But anyways, that's where they should have stayed. Just put that in the back corner of your mind and keep that for in their future days reading. But I also want you to point out to you in verse 16 of chapter 24, Moses goes up the mountain, and during that 7-day period, it is on day 7 that the Lord calls to him. Moses has to linger in God's presence in order to encounter his voice. If you hunger for God's voice, you could ask yourself this question: am I willing to linger there and in order to experience and hear his voice? In any one of these 25 questions you could be asking today, spend time and just recognize, oh Lord, open my eyes that I would see how wonderful your law is, and help me live like that.